Yes, so I'm Glen from Cicero Centre for Climate Research in Oslo, and last night we had the global carbon budget come out, and that has the sort of latest estimates of fossil fuel emissions, land use change, and also the sinks of carbon, such as in the ocean and the land.
Okay, so if we start off like we might with our own household budget, how much have we been spending? What are the latest figures?
So emissions have had another increase again in 2013. So emissions have increased 2%, which is a little bit lower than the last decade, which has been around almost up to 3%, but they're still increasing. Coal is behind much of that increase, and particularly in China, but also some other countries have increased their dependence on coal, Japan, Germany, and this relates to the nuclear shutdowns. But in terms of the cumulative budget, what we can sort of emit in terms of keeping temperatures below 2 degrees, we've used up about 70% of that budget. And if we keep emitting the way we are, then we'll probably use up all of that budget, so to say, in 20 to 30 years at the current emission rates.
That sounds terrifying. What happens if we go beyond that budget?
If we go beyond that budget, it just so to keep within that budget, if you like, it gives us a likely chance of staying below 2 degrees. So if we go over that budget, then it'll be 2.5 degrees or 3 degrees and so on, all the way up to, I guess, a potential of 5 or 6 degrees in a worst case scenario. And if we look at our current emissions and how they compare with the latest generation of emission scenarios coming out from the IPCC, we're still sitting quite closely to the upper high-end scenarios, so things aren't looking good at the moment.
Have you analysed options for the future? What would we need to do to get emissions down enough to keep within our budget?
So to keep within the sort of budget, most studies would show that we need global emissions to peak by around about 2020 or earlier, which is very soon. It's only 7 years or so away. And then after that, emissions would need to decrease quite rapidly, 3, 4, 5% per year globally, which means that some individual countries will have to work much harder, much higher mitigation rates. And to put this into perspective, if you look in European countries, in France, Belgium, Sweden, the countries that installed nuclear power in the 70s, 80s and so on, they achieved emission reductions of 3, 4, 5%. So we would have to do that sort of thing decade after decade globally to be able to keep within the sort of 2 degree budget.
Is it possible?
I think it's possible, but it's very hard. There's a lot of inertia in the system. We're still installing coal power plants, and they sit around for many years, decades, 40, 50 years, and we can expect them to keep emitting into the future. So it takes a lot to sort of slow down the ship, if you like, and turn it around to go back down. So I think the biggest challenge is getting over the inertia that we currently have in our system and getting us on the pathway downwards. So that's the biggest short-term challenge, and then we can sort of worry about how we accelerate emission reductions afterwards. But first of all, we have to get to that hump, the peak in emissions, and bring things down.
How can we overcome that inertia? Will it mean what technologies might save us?
This is, there's been a very strong growth in renewable energies in the last years. So looking at China as an example, it's had last year, 2012, renewable energies grew at about 25%, which is huge and a fantastic growth rate. But at the same time, coal consumption has grown at around about 6, 7, 8%. And this completely offsets any gains that have made in renewables. Renewables are growing from a very low level, whereas coal is already very established globally. About 40% of emissions are from coal consumption. And even a few percent growth on top of that is a very large increase in emissions. So it's not necessarily new technologies that will save us. They're coming, but they're growing from such a low level. It's what do we do about the existing infrastructure that we have, the 40% or so of coal globally? How do we sort of reduce that to 35% to 30% over the coming years? And that's the real challenge.
I guess that's what these talks are all about, is providing the environment and the targets to do that. What would need to happen at these talks to put us on the path towards keeping in the budget?
I think it's quite important to have a good overview of where we need to go, how much the challenge is. So at the moment, everything's quite incremental, a lot of process involved, but this needs to be made more concrete. And there's going to have to be a sort of consistency between what countries are willing to promise, what they're willing to pledge, if you like, and what they, in a sense, need to pledge, and how to distribute that burden between countries. How you achieve that is a challenge, of course, but I think somewhere there needs to be some sort of concrete goal and in the pathway of emissions, what emissions will need to look like, so we know how much we need to reduce our emissions to get to a 2-degree pathway or to stay below a 2-degree pathway. So having that sort of aspirational goal in terms of carbon instead of maybe 2 degrees a temperature target is maybe important because it's a bit more concrete. Countries can see, directly relate the allowable budget, if you like, of carbon emissions with their current emissions of CO2.
Could you give us some figures on that? I think China has said that they are looking to peak by 2025. So does that mean that other countries have to make much stronger cuts, for example?
You're always going to have a sort of, I guess, a tug-of-war between developed, if you like, and developing countries. And of course, the more developed countries will reduce their emissions now, that will allow a bit more space for developing countries to grow and develop. The challenge with China, it's such a large share of global emissions that whatever happens in China is quite critical to what happens in global emissions. But you can talk about fairness, should we have a per capita distribution or historic responsibility or something like that. But it's very important that we put this in the context of what's achievable, what's feasible. And so maybe if just using US as an example has high per capita emissions and high cumulative emissions historically, and maybe, if you do a sort of fair distribution, it needs to reduce its emissions at 10% per year. But that's maybe impossible for the US to achieve. So you have to accept that the US can't do that immediately. So it's going to have to be a bit of tug-of-war between, what the countries sort of should do in a sense in terms of fairness and equity and what they actually can do in terms of physically getting things to happening, getting regulations and laws through Congress or whatever that may be, the governments, and physically how you can install infrastructure and change things. So it needs to be a mix of reality in a sense and of some aspirational equity, fairness type thinking.
Have you got any nice top-line figures? I think in Copenhagen we talked about cutting global emissions in half from 1990 levels by 2050. Do you have a sort of a goal for now?
Not in that context off the top of my head, but I think we would have to achieve much more. That to stay within the 2-degree limit would have to have a much larger than a 50% reduction by 2050 of our current emissions. And if you sort of think about it, at current emission rates, we've got 20 or 30 years to use up the sort of allowable budget before we exceed this likely chance of exceeding 2 degrees. So it's a bit of, if we sort of delay the peak in global emissions, that means we've got to reduce emissions much quicker, and so the emissions in 2050 will have to be much lower. If we can get the peak in emissions much earlier, then we will be allowed more emissions in 2050. So putting things in the context of a budget sort of shows how we can distribute things over time, but it also has the concern that it may sort of give, in a sense, allow you to delay that we can reduce those emissions later. But more we reduce now, the easier it will be later.
In that sense, do you think in a way the talks are going backwards with Japan and Australia stepping back from their emissions targets?
I think always, from year to year as governments change, so there's been a change of government in Australia which has changed the policy outcome. There's been events in Japan with the nuclear accident which has changed the way things work. I think you're going to get this in negotiations anyway. There's going to be some unexpected events, and some countries will go backwards and forwards over time. We have to accept that, but I think it's about getting a big framework in place. And countries may promise in a legally binding sense. Their promises may be a bit conservative, and maybe through other avenues or other fora, they may reduce emissions by a greater amount where it's not legally binding. So these negotiations may be a bit more conservative than what may happen in practice. So maybe that's a little bit of hope for the future.